troops now helping Afghan farmers grow that opium. Nick Schifrin reports from Afghanistan on a controversial new policy.
In western Kandahar, poppy farmers score, till, harvest their crop, and the Americans do nothing to stop them. U.S. soldiers greet farmers.
Can you show me which poppy field is yours?
They commiserate with farmers having a bad harvest.
Tell him I'm very sorry for his field this year, and hopefully he has a better harvest next year.
And in one case, they even paid a farmer $1,000 after U.S. and Afghan special forces burned his crop.
If you can come down to the base or on my next visit, I'll make a payment.
This is controversial. The opium trade is the Taliban's main source of funding.
Around here, this poppy isn't only a plant, it's the very basis of the economy here. Poppy grows everywhere in this area, and most of the farmers base their entire income for the entire season on this harvest.
And that's why soldiers ignore and encourage the farmers. If the U.S. burned their crop, farmers would blame the U.S. for their poverty and turn toward the Taliban. I'm not going to lie to you, this farmer says. If my poppy were destroyed, I would be very angry.
If we secure them having a good harvest, now they're going to get paid for all their hard
Work,
and then we can deal with the trafficking afterwards.
And that is the new U.S. policy. After farmers get paid, try to capture drug traffickers. These troops have confiscated 10,000 pounds of opium before the profit reached the Taliban. One day the U.S. hopes to convince farmers to choose legal crops. Until then, the seeds of the insurgency will continue to grow in these fields. Nick
There are scores and scores of uninformed countrymen who believe that America fights wars abroad in order to pursue our freedoms at home. This is a fallacy. Since the end of World War II, the United States has been involved in several conflicts throughout the world, all in the interest of big business. Arms makers, industrialists, beverage makers, utilities providers, and bankers all have vested interest in our brave soldiers being sent to fight abroad. During the Vietnam and Afghanistan wars, the manufacturing and trafficking of heroin from those war-torn regions increased at the time of our country's tenure of fighting in those areas. Most of the heroin produced was packaged for sale in the U.S. This is Mike Rupert, former officer with the LAPD, political and social activist, and author of many books and publications. Before his untimely death in April of 2014, Mr. Rupert had been involved in exposing elements of the U.S. government, business leaders, and world leaders conducting underhanded and criminal activities. The following clips are of Mr. Rupert questioning President Clinton's CIA Director Deutsch about some of the CIA's illegal activities at a meeting in South Central Los Angeles.
Los Angeles police narcotics detective that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time. have information about CIA illegal activity in drugs, you should immediately bring that information to wherever you want. Let me suggest 3 places. The Los Angeles Police Department. I'm sorry, others want to hear this answer. I am sorry, others want to hear this answer. It is your choice, the Los Angeles Police Department, the Inspector General, or office of one of your Congress persons from this. Something else. If this information turns up wrongdoing, we will bring the people to justice and make them accountable. All right, Congressman Dixon.
Maybe the director knew about the drug trafficking, maybe he didn't, or maybe he just didn't want to know. It's hard to point out who knew or did what when dealing with a government that operates in the shadows. But what we do know is that illicit drugs are here and they are rampant. The trafficking of narcotics has become intertwined in our country's economy. Bankers realize this and take advantage. Politicians are beholden to these bankers. William Jefferson Clinton, 42nd President of the United States and twice elected governor of the state of Arkansas. During Mr. Clinton's governorship, there was a scandal that became known to some as the Mina Connection, which involved drug trafficking, political corruption, and murder. There are some researchers that believe Mr. Clinton was involved in this scandal, either by collusion, cover-up, turning a blind eye, or all of the above.
The Republicans are trying to blame you for the existence of a small air base at Mina, Arkansas. This base was set up by George Bush and Oliver North and the CIA to help the Iran-Contras, and they brought in plane load after plane load of cocaine there for sale in the United States, and then they took the money and bought weapons and took them back to the Contras, all of which was illegal, as you know, under the Rowland Act. But tell me, did they tell you that this had to be in existence because of national security?
Well, let me answer the question. No, they didn't tell me anything about it. They didn't say anything to me about it. The airport in question and all the events in question were the subject of state and federal inquiries. It was primarily a matter for federal jurisdiction. The state really had next to nothing to do with it. The local prosecutor did conduct an investigation based on what was within the jurisdiction of state law. The rest of it was under jurisdiction of the United States attorneys who were appointed successively by previous administrations. We had nothing, zero, to do with it, and everybody who's ever looked into it knows that. Nothing was going to be done on the federal level. That's when I began more actively pursuing it.
Prosecutor Black, a Clinton supporter, met with the governor and handed him a letter requesting money for a state grand jury on Mina.
His response to me was that he would get a man, something to the effect that he would get a man on it and would get word back to me. And I never heard back.
Years later, Clinton said he offered $25,000 to Prosecutor Black's boss to fund a grand jury. But Charles Black and his boss claim they never heard about any offer of money from Governor Clinton.
I believe Bill Clinton's an honest, respectable man, and I have to believe that he did that. But the fact is, I never got that word myself.
join me here. Would you be seated, please, ladies and gentlemen? Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with bipartisan leaders. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
The term war on drugs became popular after President Nixon declared drug abuse in the United States as public enemy number one. This was the start of the federal government devoting considerable resources toward the eradication of drugs, rehab efforts for addicts, and locking criminals up. During the time of the Iran-Contra scandal, the Reagan administration's number one concern was the eradication of communism. Some believe that there were those within the Reagan administration that took a by any means necessary stance against communism, even if that meant using segments of the American public to accomplish this goal. This would lead to the Iran-Contra affair itself, the flooding of cocaine into Southern California, and the Mina affair, as well as the flooding of cocaine and other narcotics throughout this nation. Some would argue that the trafficking of narcotics is now the number one segment of the U.S. economy. The death of college basketball star Len Bias on June 19, 1986, ushered in a reform of drug laws in this nation. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 brought mandatory minimum sentencing, new asset forfeiture laws, and a 100-to-1 sentencing ratio for crack versus cocaine. Some would argue that the reform in drug laws were racist in nature. That very well may be the case, but there is one notable point to this argument. The Congressional Black Caucus of the U.S. Congress heavily backed these reforms. This is Gary Webb, journalist. He gained notoriety due to his reports in the San Jose Mercury News, known as the Dark Alliance series. His series detailed the origins of the crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles. Also alleged in the series was the involvement of the CIA in drug-running operations into LA carried out by the Contras, a U.S.-backed right-wing rebel group. Mr. Webb's reports also led to a book based on the Dark Alliance series. Those works created a firestorm of criticism and little praise from other journalists, government officials, and activists. Mr. Webb was found dead in his home on December 10, 2004, from 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Official cause of death: suicide. The war on drugs has been nothing short of a disaster for our nation. The smuggling of drugs into this country continues on a large scale, and it is a well-oiled and thriving business. The pharmaceutical industry, with the development of highly addictive and legal forms of drugs used for pain, helps to make sure that there will be many that will go through the hideous burden of being addicted to some form of narcotic. We are a nation of instant gratification. We seek results ASAP. Drug addiction is not a criminal problem. It is a medical problem. Drugs will continue to thrive in this country as long as those in charge keep the status quo regarding medical treatment, criminal justice, and feeding the people propaganda. There are currently hundreds of thousands of nonviolent drug offenders in prison serving sentences that are, in a lot of cases, longer than those who commit crimes against women or children. A majority of these nonviolent offenders serving these sentences are people of color. Meanwhile, the policing policies in this country and in most communities have gone from protecting and serving to controlling those living in the communities that they serve. If we refer to something as a war on whatever, there has to be an enemy in the equation for that concept to work. We need new solutions. We need to come together as one. We need to stop the hate and violence.